Thank you for the invitation and to all of you for coming to listen. So I'm going to be talking about this collection, as the title indicates, more from the perspective of a researcher. My students do actually use these documents for writing their undergraduate theses, but I haven't incorporated them into my teaching in nearly as systematic a way as Matt has. But I think they do have a particular value, which I'll try to explain in sort of general and then in more particular terms. So on the one hand, all of the materials digitized or otherwise from the National Archives relating to this material, overwhelmingly they tend to be in English. And as such, they're not a substitute for materials that are actually produced in this region in Persian, which is the main language of record and of literature, or indeed in Russian, which is the other main sort of imperial language there. So we have to bear that in mind when we're sort of evaluating how to use them and how valuable they might be. On the other hand, they do have a particular value because of the inaccessibility of many alternative archival repositories and resources across this region. So doing primary research in Iran has become increasingly difficult over the last 15 years or so, and given current events is unlikely to get any easier in the near future. I probably don't need to expand much on the sad situation in Afghanistan. The Afghan National Archives have apparently survived. They do still exist, but nobody has really managed to make any effective use of them, partly because they're not really properly catalogued, and obviously getting into Afghanistan to do research is more or less impossible now. And Russia, which was actually quite open and relatively easy to work in for about 30 years, is of course now also a closed country. It is thankfully still possible to do research in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the other former Soviet Central Asian republics. But still, that sort of sudden, or in some cases sudden, in some cases long-term, narrowing of archival access on the ground makes the resources available here, which are largely a legacy of the British Raj before the East India Company in South Asia, all the more important, both those in the India Office Library and here at the National Archives. But these, sorry, yes, I should skip over that, not very important. These resources do have, apart from the linguistic limitations I've mentioned, there's a couple of other structural ones that I want to talk about. So one of them is the fact that most of them, or rather a lot of them anyway, are framed within this question of Anglo-Russian rivalry in Central Asia, commonly known as the Great Game. Now, I put it up there in inverted commas because I actually really detest this expression. This is kind of self-defeating. You know, if I wanted to sell books and indeed sell my subject area, this is clearly what I should refer to it as. It has enormous selling power. And I too was captivated by the work of Peter Hopkirk and others who wrote on this theme when I was young. But it's actually really a completely inadequate paradigm for understanding the history of Central Asia, Persia, Afghanistan, that wider region in this period. One of the main reasons for that being that it simply erases or eclipses any question of sort of local agency or local actors. You know, all we're interested in is this great power rivalry that's taking place in a region which Lord Curzon described as a chessboard on which the two great powers could make their moves. But of course it's not a chessboard. You know, it's a real part of the world where real people live, which has political history and cultural histories of its own, and did so in this period as well. So quite a lot of my published work has actually been dedicated to trying to kick out the Great Game cliche and replace it with an understanding of the region's history that actually does allow us to foreground local actors, local states, and to some degree at least sources in local languages, although my main research language is Russian. So that's one thing. When we look at British archives on this region, as I'll explain, it's not all Great Game stuff, but there's an awful lot of that in there, because ultimately our perspective on this, the idea that really everything that's happening here is part of some big Russian plot to invade India, comes from the British perspective. This was certainly what the British believed for much of the 19th century, certainly starting in the 1820s. It doesn't actually mean that that's really what the Russians had in mind. Not because they wouldn't have liked to, but without wanting to bore with the details, because it wasn't really logistically possible. And also because they were much more preoccupied with their relations with Central Asian states and peoples than they were with the British. So this this massive looming fear of Russia that we find in British sources is not really reciprocated on the Russian side, and of course is very, very different when seen from a Central Asian or an Afghan or a Persian perspective. So that's something we have to bear in mind, that most British documents have this kind of fixation, and many of them are produced with this in mind. So what is the interest or the use of this collection? Well, as you can imagine, it's very substantial. I mean, these are records that come from multiple different sources. Some of them come via the government of India and are duplicated to some degree in the India Office records at the British Library. Britain had consulates in Tehran, but also in Mashhad and later on in Bushehr as well. So some of it is directly relayed material from these regions. The British legation in Kabul, actually between 1881 and 1919, is representing the government of India rather than the British government. So again, a lot of that material is in the India Office Library. A general sort of rule is that, you know, the further away you get from these nodes of British power, you know, whether that's Gilgit up on the in the sort of northern frontiers of Kashmir in Central Asia, or Mashhad on the borders of what's now Turkmenistan. The further away you get from those, the more sort of vague and often inaccurate the information that was available to the British tends to be. But that's not an absolutely consistent pattern. So now I'm going to talk, having talked about some of the ways in which this collection is perhaps needs to be handled with care, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we do find in it that are in fact enormously interesting. So I've stuck one example up here, which is from the digitized collection. Which is a report from the British military attaché in St. Petersburg in 1875. And he's reporting a casual conversation which he's had with Russia's Governor-General in Turkestan, Konstantin Petrovich von Kaufmann, this heavily mustachioed chap here on your right, where Kaufmann sort of remarks to him, and he's commenting here very much on the kind of British paranoia that I've just been referring to. When speaking to Englishmen in the Central Asian question, he felt he must in their eyes appear as the fox in the fable, who professes the most pacific intentions when on the point of making away with a tempting goose, as he invariably holds the language of peace, is at the same time almost always engaged in military expeditions. So this tells us, obviously, you know, von Kaufmann is aware of and actually prepared to ironize this British fear of his activities. It's also a reflection of the fact that, indeed, that is very much what the Russians had been doing in Central Asia over the previous decade and a half. They had been conquering territory like there was no tomorrow, first from the Khanate of Kokand, then from the Emirate of Bukhara, finally from the Khanate of Khiva, which had been conquered by the Russians in 1873, two years before this conversation took place. But what I really want to stress here is that, for obvious reasons, this is a kind of little nugget of information which, in fact, we would not get from Russian archives, because it's a record of something ephemeral, of a conversation that probably took place in French, actually, although it's being reported to us here in English, and which is not going to be duplicated in any other source, almost certainly, because it's on the basis of it is this kind of chance encounter between the British attaché in St. Petersburg and von Kaufmann. Now, that's an example, I think, of where this collection is actually really valuable to the researcher. And it gives us an indication, actually, of how we need to handle it. So, quite often the reports that come from the British embassy in St. Petersburg are relaying very second-hand information. So, for instance, when the Russians are making territorial annexations in Central Asia from the mid-1860s through to the really late 1870s, the information is coming through St. Petersburg often with a 4 or 5 month time lag. You know, so it's not exactly fresh off the press, as it were. So it's interesting from in perspective of sort of what did the British know and when did they know it, but not if we actually want to understand, you know, when things happened or indeed what happened. And for that, we need to turn to other sources. On the other hand, if we're talking about kind of high-level politics at the centre of power in St. Petersburg, well, actually, the British legation has access to these things in a way that local actors did not necessarily. Von Kaufmann, this kind of sort of conversation that's being reported here with von Kaufmann actually would have been very unlikely to take place in Tashkent, not least because there were no British officials that were allowed to be stationed there. So I guess that's, an example of one sort of form of information that we can get out of this that is actually really interesting. This is something that's a bit more, I guess, sort of, mainstream in a way. This document is basically sort of telling us about the origins of the First Anglo-Afghan War, something which many of you may know of as one of the greatest sort of disasters and imperial humiliations of the British Empire in the 19th century. The invasion of Afghanistan, which took place in 1839, was prompted by the arrival of a Russian envoy in the, what we can, I suppose, call the Afghan capital 2 years previously, in 1837. What's referred to here by Sir John McNeill in his dispatch from the ministry in Tehran as Captain Witkiewicz. So his real name was Witkiewicz. He was actually Polish. He was a Polish exile from Vilnius in what's now Lithuania, who'd been sent to work out his, he'd been part of a Polish nationalist organization. He was deported to the steppe frontier at the age of 14, according to some sources, learnt Persian and Turkic, and eventually became a trusted Russian envoy in Central Asia. And there are a few things about this document that I think are particularly interesting. So one, of course, is simply the fact that it's reporting Witkiewicz's arrival. That is what actually triggers this sequence of events that ultimately leads to the British invading Afghanistan. There's also the person who wrote the dispatch. So Sir John McNeill was actually not the British minister in Tehran. He was ostensibly the surgeon to the British minister there. But he was a much more forceful character than any of those who formerly held this post. And was not quite single-handedly, but certainly was a prominent sort of publicist in terms of alerting Britain's ruling classes, elites, public opinion to what he considered to be a kind of existential Russian threat in Central Asia. So he published a book called The Progress and Position of Russia in the East, which did a lot to kind of shift opinion in official circles in Britain towards the idea that Russia represented a really serious threat in this region. So this, in a sense, is kind of the realization of all of McNeill's fears. He's kind of, he was, in a sense, he was primed to react in the way that he did to Witkiewicz's arrival. The other thing is he notes, and this is where we come back to the question of local agency, he notes in passing, Witkiewicz, or Witkiewicz as he calls him, is sent in consequence of the arrival in Russia of the agent whom Dost Muhammad Khan sent into Russia last year. And this is entirely correct. So Witkiewicz did not come to Kabul unprompted. He actually was accompanying an Afghan envoy who had been sent by Dost Muhammad Khan to Nicholas I in St. Petersburg, who had been received there. Witkiewicz was actually sent with him back to Kabul, but the Afghan envoy died when they reached Tiflis, in what is now Georgia, and Witkiewicz sort of carried on his own. So the point being then that the agency here, in a sense, is actually from the Afghan side. They were the ones who made the first approach here. It wasn't, in fact, the Russians themselves at all. So the last example I want to show you is a different type of document. And this will almost certainly have come via the India office. So it will have come via the government of India. And this is a report which is it's called the Kabul Diary. And these sort of recur at regular intervals throughout the records relating to British relations with Afghanistan. But diary is not really quite the right term for it. What this is a sort of regular newsletter which is being produced by a British agent in Kabul who is part of a network of Persian language news writers, or Akhbar Nevis, which the British had, in a sense, or rather initially the East India Company, had taken over from the Mughal Empire, or from the Mughal Empire's successor states. So there's a wonderful book by the late Christopher Bailey called Empire and Information, which explains how this process took place. You had this network of news writers who, for a retainer, would send regular kind of updates on what was going on at various courts across India and beyond. this was how, if you were, well, either the Mughal emperor himself or an ambitious sort of post-Mughal ruler, such as, say, the Nawab of Lucknow, the Nizam of Hyderabad, you would maintain this kind of network of news writers to keep you informed of what was going on in court politics elsewhere. The East India Company basically took over these networks wholesale and maintained them and continued to sort of absorb and receive these materials in Persian, which they then translated into English for their own purposes. And as we can see, that continued right the way up into the 1880s and 1890s. So this is a report which is talking about the kind of the local reaction to the Russian conquest of the western half, the eastern half of the Zarafshan Valley, which is one of the major riverine oases of Central Asia, in which both Samarkand and Bukhara are located. So in 1868, under von Kaufmann, whom we've already met, the Russians had launched a campaign against Bukhara from their main center in Tashkent. They defeated the Bukharans multiple times, and they annexed Samarkand and the western end, the eastern end of the Zarafshan Valley. This report is providing us with some insight. We have to be careful about precisely how we use it, on elements of the local reaction to this. So the news writer, who would have had his own informant located in Bukhara itself, the common language between all these regions being Persian, it's all part of a wider Persianate linguistic sphere. So he's saying, well, initially, yes, the people of Samarkand actually preferred Russian administration. They, found it less arbitrary, perhaps, or perhaps because the Russians did actually lower the tax burden when they took over in Samarkand. But then it seems that their opinion has changed. The Russians have attempted to persuade the people of Samarkand to send their women to schools, because many women in Bukhara and Shahrisabz took flight to Samarkand, and in company with women at the latter place enjoyed undue liberty by riding or walking in the bazaars without a veil on. So, what are we to make of a source of this kind? I mean, obviously it reflects a particular set of cultural prejudices, which may or may not be accurately represented here. It may represent, there's actually very little evidence that the Russians attempted in any way to interfere in the sort of normal patriarchal gender relations which already existed in the region before the conquest. But what's perhaps significant is that many people believed that that's what they were doing, that was seen as sort of immediately emblematic of alien, or as in this case, Christian rule over a Muslim region. The point being that this is quite far from, as I think we've already discussed, there's often this assumption that British official archives will only contain sort of top-down official material. This is something that actually comes from a completely different sort of episteme, as it were. It's been somewhat mangled in the translation, very probably, but it allows us to some extent to penetrate that Persian sphere, which otherwise, at least in the archival sense, is actually quite close to us at the moment. So I'm actually going to, I think, wind up at this point just by saying that the collection, from the point of view of the researcher, then, I mean, obviously, anybody who really minds it well is then going to want to come to the TNA to sort of see what wasn't digitized alongside it. But actually, it's an extraordinarily rich collection in and of itself, which many of my students have been using with profit also to write their undergraduate theses as well. I would say this is a fascinating part of the world. I work on it after all, but it represents some challenges when it comes to teaching, because so much of the relevant material is not in English. But here we do have a very rich, if not entirely unproblematic, body of sources in English that can actually render it to some extent accessible and comprehensible to English-speaking undergraduates. And that, I think, is an enormously valuable service. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yes. I'm going back to AI again. Counting in the British Library. You're saying that a lot of these sources are impenetrable because they're not in the English language. AI can translate vast things at scale. Is that something that is going to come and is going to prove useful, and is that on the AM's well done?
Well, I can't answer on behalf of AM. I mean, I can say, I mean, it's, I think at the moment at least it's probably more workable for Russian than it is for Persian, and that's partly because you know, there's a lot more training of AI has taken place with Russian language text. It's because a lot more is available in digital form or in, you know, sort of transcribed form, and it can therefore work with it. I mean, I must admit I'm a bit of an AI skeptic in the sense of seeing this as a substitute for actually, because of course when you learn a language you're not just learning the sort of technicalities of how to translate stuff, you are learning how to, at least to some extent, inhabit a culture. And that's something I don't think that AI can really provide a substitute for. I mean, of course that's more relevant for researchers than it is for students. So in terms of making a wider range of resources available for the purposes of teaching, I think AI may turn out to be very important. I think it's going to be a little while before we see it applied on a massive scale to Central Asian Persian, purely because it's probably not in anybody's commercial interest to do so.
I can speak for AM if I may. We've actually recently released a collection source from the Bancroft Library in California, which is Mexico in history. And a lot of that is Spanish language sources. We inherited a lot of Spanish language metadata with that. And we did use AI processes to help us translate that. And then one of the ways that we sort of responded to the kind of inherent challenges there was we sort of coupled it with real translators and experts in kind of that readable language as well. And then we use the same processes to translate our contextual material, so all the essays are available in English and Spanish in that particular resource, for example. And before we had that technology, it wouldn't have been a resource we'd have been able to do. I should say that's Spanish language and a Latin alphabet, which is kind of easier at this stage than Cyrillic or something else. But yeah, we've I think made a start on what I certainly see as being a much longer journey to incorporating all of the opportunities there into this alphabet.
Hello, I'm Emily in the Data Team. I'm interested, earlier we were talking about how students come across this material and thinking about like research terms and browsability, but as a researcher I'd be interested to know how you kind of go about looking at this material, your first steps. Do you look at it kind of periodically by file class series, or do you find that you're doing these keyword searches as well?
So certainly yes, keyword searches are a part, and as we've already discussed, they often have to come in many different forms. So what we're usually dealing with are Anglo-Indian spellings of Russian and Persian terms, and these vary enormously. So you have to have a considerable repertoire of variants to enter. And the same goes for place names, which are not, the spelling of which is not standardized at this point in the 19th century. So you have, so certainly that's an important part of it. But if, for instance, you're let's say you're trying to sort of work out when did the British find out, or what did they know about the Russian annexation of the Fergana Valley in 1876? Well, your starting point basically is the date when it actually happened. Then you actually have to sort of keep ploughing through material for, well, I guess up until you actually finally find a mention of it, and also try to then reconstruct what was the sort of chain of communication which allowed them to receive it. I mean, quite a lot of the time, they actually tell you, they say, well, the Journal de Saint Petersburg has reported that. And you think, okay, right, so they waited for an official report to appear in the government gazette in St. Petersburg, and then they've taken it from the French translation thereof. And that helps to explain why, it's 5 months on that they've actually worked out, what was happening. So, as I say, quite a lot of the time you're amazed, in fact, by how poor their sources of information tended to be. But that makes it all the more striking when you realise, no, actually, this time they've got somebody on the spot. Not only that, they've got somebody on the spot who really seems to know what they're talking about. So often you can use this material most productively when you're triangulating it with other sources, actually, quite a lot of the time, because the as I say, it varies a good deal, but let's say the sort of the panopticon of the British imperial state, which operates, I guess, more effectively in a domestic setting, more effectively in the settler colonies of the British Empire is often has several lenses obscured when it's looking at this part of the world, and is very reliant upon having, whether there's a good local informant in place, whether they actually have, let's say, a consul in Mashhad who really knows his business and speaks Persian well, or whether there's a dud, which quite often there is.
Given the problems of travelling to some of the archives you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, and the comment you just made there about triangulation of sources, can you reflect a little bit more on how you go about that triangulation of sources?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, partly, and it's actually very often not something you can really expect students to do unprompted, not least because often it means triangulating the sources in other languages, and that's kind of what you have to do when you're trying to write a research paper that makes use of this or similar English language material. I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm fortunate in that I spent the last 20 years working in Russian archives. I can't go there anymore, but I've accumulated quite a lot of material in that time. And as I say, you can still work in Uzbekistan, which has the largest, really probably actually the largest archive anywhere in Central Asia. The material is mostly in Russian, in Persian, or in Chagatai Turkic. Another difference compared to, say, the 20 years ago, or indeed the Cold War, which is when Russian archives were last basically closed to us, is huge amounts of published material, at least, is now available digitally. So you can cross-reference with published sources in Russian quite easily even now, and that helps things. A good deal. But no, I agree. From the teaching perspective, actually, it's a bit tricky. I mean, I found when I'm supervising theses that use material of this kind, I have to, I often have to sort of provide the steer myself to the student, because if they're just going to go on, the primary material that's available to them, they're quite likely to end up, I guess, heading off on a tangent, which, ultimately is produced by the limitations of the knowledge that was available to these British officials 100 or more years ago. Thank you.